Our guest for this evening, I'm really happy to introduce you all to Riki Wilchins. And since the mid-1990s, Riki has been highly active in founding a number of organizations and events that have focused on gender issues, including the Transexual Menace in 1995. This was a direct action group for transgender rights, which had representatives in over 40 cities. The next year, she helped launch GenderPAC, the first national political advocacy group devoted to gender identity rights. Along with Susan Wright, Riki helped form the National Coalition for Sexual Freedom, a BDSM organization. And she has written extensively on gender theory and politics, including 4 books, the first one being Read My Lips, Sexual Subversion and the End of Gender. I recommend it highly. Shameless plug there. She's also written Queer Theory / Gender Theory and Instant Primer. Transgressive, how transgender activists took on gay rights, feminism, the media, and Congress and won. And I also highly recommend that one for those of you that are kind of the political junkies in our group that really want to know about the foundation of trans rights groups. And she also wrote Voice from Beyond the Sexual Binary. She's written extensively for numerous publications as well. Riki's done training on gender for the White House, the CDC, and the Office of Women's Health. And in 2001, Time magazine selected her as, quote, 100 Civic Innovators for the 21st century. I'm really thrilled to have this opportunity to speak with someone who truly is one of my heroes. Especially in light of the fact that we've taken parallel journeys. Riki and I both transitioned at a time when we were both feeling pretty isolated in this world. We were treated by a medical establishment that measured our success by our ability to blend in and disappear into society. But Riki stood up in response to gender stereotypes and anti-transgender sentiment. And she became one of the most effective trans activists we have seen. So I'm deeply grateful for her work, her graciousness, and in sitting down with me tonight for this interview. So welcome, Riki.
Thank you so much for having me. A pleasure to be back here in Pennsylvania since my partner's from there.
Well, you missed some great thunderstorms earlier. Something just rolled right through the Lehigh Valley earlier. And I guess in full disclosure, you're on Miami Beach, right? As we speak.
I am, but Gina's from, little places like Lehighton and Hellertown. Most people haven't heard of, so.
I travel through there regularly. So let's see, let's begin at the beginning. And so my first question for you is, what triggered your decision to become an activist for both the trans, and I should have said the GenderQueer community as well, because you were a pioneer in that area as well. So what initially triggered you to take this stance?
I was shanghaied into protesting the exclusion of trans from I think it was the 1993 New York Gay, Lesbian, and Bisexual Pride March. And I think that was the year that Phyllis Fry from Texas had threatened to come into town and lay across the road and force them to step around her. And of course, they didn't want to have to call the cops on a trans person. That would have been terrible. So there was this big kind of hoo-ha going on. And then that was kind of part of it. I got involved in that. And the other thing, I guess, was Nancy Jean Burkhalter got thrown out of the Michigan Women's Music Festival for being transgender. That really spoke to me, because for years I had told myself that even though I wanted to go, that I probably wouldn't have a good time, and I probably wouldn't know anybody there, and it was in the middle of the woods, there were probably lots of mosquitoes. But I realized the big reason that I hadn't gone was because I was afraid I'd get thrown out. And someplace I was not only afraid of that, but I also was afraid that I was being improbably paranoid And when that happened, it really just resonated for me. I remember reading a piece, and I cannot remember the woman's name, but she wrote a piece about the entire life she hadn't lived and the places she hadn't gone, the groups she hadn't joined, because she either wouldn't be welcome, was told she wouldn't be welcome, or simply was afraid that she wouldn't be welcome. I thought, God, that exactly describes those years for me. So when Nancy got thrown out, her best friend, Janice Walworth from Boston, reached out and said, we're going to be doing this event there, and would you come and join us? And I showed up, and that was kind of one thing led to another, I guess. Certainly wasn't a considered or logical decision in any case. I had run from trans activism for years.
Yeah, I think in one of your books you alluded to the trans exclusivity of the Michigan Women's Music Festival, and for some of our people tuning in that really don't know much about that, I mean, it was an annual event, a huge event in Michigan that brought in women recording artists and women performers from all over the country for what was it, a week or was quite a thing. So when was it in the late?
Ran for the better part of a month in the middle of August.
Yeah.
And for all intents and purposes, it was the largest annual gathering of lesbians in the country. I mean, you didn't have to be a lesbian to be there. I'm sure plenty of straight women went, but it was basically a lesbian watering hole for almost a full month.
And one year they just up and announced that they were excluding trans women. And so, can you speak to that?
Nancy actually, I didn't know this firsthand because I don't think I've ever met Nancy, strangely enough. Did I meet Nancy there? I don't think she came. But announced in a workshop that she was trans, and several festival security people showed up that evening at her tent, at her campsite, and told her and accosted her and accused her of not being a real woman, and told her she had to leave, didn't really give her time to pack up her stuff or tell Janice where she was or that she was being kicked out, and basically kicked her out on a dirt road in the middle of Michigan in the middle of the night. This was, of course, before cell phones, so it was pretty freaky and really unnecessary, really hostile. But, it's the way it was back then. Still is in some places, I guess.
So a lot of us, were kind of, we would go to these concerts when the artists came into our community. Some of us were active in the women's community, but this sort of threw kind of like a blanket damper on the whole thing to know that, we weren't even welcome within the lesbian community either. So what did you, eventually this evolved into Camp Trans.
Well, we were doing this educational event for a full week, and across from the main gate, I think there were 6 of us, and hundreds of people would walk out of the festival. Janice had planned a whole series of workshops, and nobody knew what to expect, and hundreds of people came out. And I think I had flown in with 24 Menace t-shirts, and they were all gone within the first day. And festival goers would try to buy them, and I'd say, you can buy them, but they're free if you'll wear them in the festival. And so everybody walked back in the gate wearing Menace t-shirts, which really pissed off festival security, including some festival security people, one of whom got fired for wearing one. So I looked at, I said to Janice, this could scale. There's tremendous interest here. And I said, we have to have a name. And I had planned to do a speak out in New York City supposedly as a fundraiser, but also just kind of to focus awareness. And we needed something to call it for this event at the New York Gay Community Center, which was hosting it. And I said, it's got to be Camp Trans, and the name caught. Janice always hated the name, but boy, it caught like gangbusters. And the next year we had just, you know, workshops every day. We must have gotten thousands of people. I flew in Leslie Feinberg, who grew a huge crowd. The Lesbian Avengers came in en masse. I mean, there's this whole big thing. I mean, it wasn't that trans people hadn't been thrown out of stuff before. I mean, trans people have been kept out of the National Women's Conference and other places, but this was a clear dividing line where a group, you know, an event was saying, you can't come. And it wasn't just one day, it was every day. You know, every time we were not allowed in. And so it became kind of this giant, you know, symbol of trans exclusionary radical feminists, what are now called TERFs. And it gave people something to organize around and discuss in terms of trans inclusion. So it was, it's still, I think, seen as kind of a paradigmatic moment in the movement, even though it was in the middle of nowhere, but it was really a very clear discussion. Are trans women welcome in women's spaces or not? And who is allowed to, more importantly, because I'm not as interested in that question as I am in who gets to make the decision. Because once you figure out who gets to decide, the whole discussion is over.
It seems to me that that's sort of how you focus your activism, in the fact that you find out who the decision makers are and then figure out a way to get to them and then work from there. But I think with Michigan Women's Festival, they really never did reverse their stand, did they?
Well, it turns out I kind of met the woman who owned it. She actually was one of the first people when I walked in the door who came up to me, and she screamed in my face, "We don't want you here," and then walked off. So I didn't find out until afterwards that was her. But the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force, and I forget who else, was it Equality Michigan? Anyway, a couple groups signed a public letter basically saying that they were against the policy. And the woman who owned the festival, I mean, this was a profit-making venture. This was not something public. It was a private, it was essentially a public event for legal purposes because anybody could go up and ask for a ticket, but it was owned. You know, so this isn't fair. You haven't engaged us in dialogue. We need to talk about this. So they all rescinded their things, said, no, we're going to engage in dialogue. And the next year she shut it down and said, we're going out of business for 25 years.
Yep.
I'm telling you, turf to the end, turf to the end.
Riki, and that brings up my other point. Was this all happened about the same time, more or less, that Janice Raymond published the transsexual, what was it called, the Transsexual Empire, and sort of launched the whole TERF thing in the feminist community?
We confronted her. I think we were the first people to confront her. The Menace confronted her at a little lesbian feminist bookstore called Judith's Room in Greenwich Village. She did not know what to make of us. And I wrote this whole thing. It's actually in my first book that it's just almost verbatim. I mean, I was just using so much of Judith Butler. And and Raymond traveled with an assistant at the time. And her assistant looked at me afterward and said, "Do you teach somewhere?" Like, no, I just read books. I'm not a college professor. I just play one in real life. But yeah, it was, I think, the first time she'd ever been confronted by the people that she was busy eviscerating. And it's one of the minor joys of my life to see her and other TERFs complain that they are now being kept out of women's spaces. I still have real trouble processing that. because I still come from a place of victimization. And it's just really hard to think of them as victims being victimized, but it's true. They're being deplatformed all over. There are lots of places that simply will not have TERF speakers. And I got to say, I'm loving
it. I have to agree with you.
Things have definitely changed, things have definitely changed.
Yeah, and the part that I have to give you kudos for is that sort of stimulated your activism and standing up for these rights, where for many of us, it kind of drove us underground. We just, who wanted to put up with that anymore? And, a lot of us didn't feel that we had the means to fight her in that point of view. It was just awful.
Well, I think, whatever the one thing that I had, so I don't think I've had many original ideas, but I'm excellent at seeing things that can catch on and taking them bigger. And Anne Ogborn had already founded Transgender Nation, which was supposed to be an offshoot of Queer Nation on the West Coast, but it just never caught on. But I thought, yeah, we could do this. We just need cool T-shirts. And actually being sold. There are T-shirt websites that are selling Transsexual Menace T-shirts online. I don't get a dime from those. I'm like, really? But anyway, I thought, you see things and you go, wow, this could scale. Camp Trans was, another one. National Gender Lobby Day was another one. I was not the first person on Capitol Hill. That was Jane Fee and I think Phyllis Fry and her wife. And I forget there was a fourth person that were going up there every year. But it's like all these things were things somebody else was doing. But yeah, you could see things that maybe the community was ready for, and that that would be fun is an interesting word to use there. But it would be fun. I think the trans community was ready to kind of break out of the defensive crouch. When I say the community, I mean basically for me it was mostly white middle class, transgender conferences. I mean that's where I actually met substantial numbers of trans people for the first time. And that's where I ran into people from the community. I mean, the internet hadn't launched yet, so everybody went to these different conferences. And they were mostly dominated by cross-dressers who got together because it was a safe place to dress, right? You take your clothes and go to a hotel someplace, and maybe even take your wife if she could tolerate the idea of you en femme, and finally have a weekend. And the whole thing was about, self-acceptance and, pride and how else would you say it? Getting your wife to accept you and so forth. Nobody was thinking about activism and pushing back. And I kept saying, I don't want acceptance. I just want my civil rights. This is a civil rights issue. It's not an issue of tolerance. It's not an issue of acceptance. It's not a medical issue. It's not a psychiatric issue. It's an issue of basic civil rights. And the other thing is you have to have fun with it. You can, if you make it fun, people enjoy it. And you also get to mock the paranoia of all the people who hated us, which, let's face it, hating trans people is just ridiculous. I'm always remember, who's the quote? Which governor was it? I think it was West Virginia, where they passed the anti-transgender athlete law, and they asked the governor, "Is this a problem? Can you name any person who's had an issue with a transgender athlete?" And his first response is, "I sign hundreds of bills every day. I can't know all of them." And the second response that he was pushed is, "I don't actually personally know any of them, but you never know. This might become a problem. People are entitled to have concerns." It's like the right is trying to whip up this transgender panic, but it's really hard because there just aren't a lot of us out there, and most of us just want to use the bathroom in peace. So hating trannies just doesn't make a lot of sense to me, but oh well.
Yeah, we're facing similar legislation working its way around in Pennsylvania as well. And so, you're right. It's a solution in search of a problem, which there isn't one.
Yeah, it's sad. It ain't going to work. This is what a hysteria looks like. They're going to get hysterical about us for about a year, and then they'll move on. It just doesn't have the legs, you know.
Yeah.
It's just trans people are outrageous to think about, but usually pretty inoffensive in person and not particularly threatening. We just don't work well.
Well, I was thinking
now, angry black women. That's something they can organize around. Another stereotype that the right seems to hate. I was just reading Michelle Obama's book, and she said, "Which part of that don't you like? Angry, black, or woman?" The answer is D, all the above. Oh God.
Yes. Yes. So yeah, you started taking on, like, I think, was it the gay games in 1994 when
You're right. That's the other thing. I knew I forgot that. Yeah, that was another one. The gay games is going to impose some kind of panty test and make people. There's this one person who was on the board who just had this up their butt and just could not get rid of this fantasy that men were going to compete as well. Why anybody would give up flying F? I mean, it's the gay freaking games, for God's sake. It's not the Olympics. Not that it should matter there either. By the way, whatever happened with the Olympics? We finally get someone in the one category you would think that men posing as women could dominate, a pure test of strength, like weightlifting, right? That's the one place we should be cleaning up. And what happens? She doesn't even medal, for God's sake. I'm telling you, even when we miscompete as women, we just can't seem to win anything. Damn. Sorry, just kidding.
But she's somebody we can point to and say, well, you know, it's not necessarily an advantage. Look at, you know, and so.
Well, that's the weird thing. You know, I have a running dialogue with a friend of mine about Laurel Hubbard. Is, you know, if she'd won, if you're really good at it, they use it against you. So the only way transgender athletes can compete as women is if they do so, but they're not really, really good. Because if they're really, really good, then it makes their argument. So what's really going to be difficult is sooner or later there is going to be a transgender athlete who will do really well and will win the gold. And then all the skies are going to open because they'll have to deal with the fact that some of us actually make really good athletes. But I think, you know, her competing makes an eloquent argument that, yes, there are certain advantages that you have. There's certain advantages that Serena Williams had. I'm especially charmed when lesbian athletes who presumably probably have a little more testosterone than average also get after us for testosterone. But testosterone does not make you a world-class athlete, not at that level. There's too many other things that go into it. So anyway, the gay games, just one person on the board had it up her butt about trans athletes and kept inserting language. And so we basically confronted the board. And one of the people on the board was, oh God, I've just forgotten her name. 1 second. Ann Northrup. I'm sorry, I actually remember Ann. Ann Northrup was the founder of ACT UP. Yeah, and Ann was on the board. And we confronted her with this really long letter, which is actually also in my first book, and basically said, "You guys screwed up, and this really sucks." And I forget who the other co-chair was sitting next to Ann. He just looked at everybody, and I thought he's going to rip us a new whatever. And he said, "My friends, we have not been radical enough. Thank you for bringing this to our attention." And they got rid of it. But then 4 years later, that same woman was on the board. It was over in Europe, and we weren't there to protest. And she got the stuff inserted back in. It was just, you know, people just get this thing in their head about trans. Can I use bad language on this? It just fucks them up. You know, it just fucks the sissies up. Cis people cannot wrap their mind around this. And it just, not all of them, but certainly some of them. And it just sticks in their craws in ways they just can't figure it out. And yeah, so that was the gay games thing. We did get rid of it for 1 year, and eventually they got rid of it. They realized it was stupid. It was against the whole gay movement. But you got to remember, back then it wasn't the LGBT movement; it was LGB.
Right. And I think the ultimate irony of all this is when Martina Navratilova took a stand against trans athletes.
Thank you.
This is someone who worked with Renee Richards.
She just did that. Yeah.
They played doubles. I mean, anyway, go figure. So
well, and someone, hang on a second, I got to go back to that. So someone just wrote an interesting, actually it's this, she's a philosopher at Cambridge, I think. She has a new book out. But she makes the argument that part of the reason that so many of the people who have problems with trans women are themselves cisgender lesbians is that they too have been gender baited. And so they are hypersensitive to this. It is ironic for Martina, who obviously had higher testosterone levels and had gorgeous muscly biceps. I mean, you know, you compare her to Christina Everett during the thing, she looked like a man on the court, and I loved her for it. I mean, I thought that was the most attractive thing. It was gorgeous. Mm-hmm. To go after trans people and say, oh, they have innate differences. Well, you have innate advantages too. It's just that yours weren't store-bought and ours were. So some of them anyway. But it's just kind of, I don't know. I've always said to my partner, I never have problems with fembot women. The kind of women you see in Austin Powers, I don't have any problem with them. They are not threatened by me at all. It's always the borderline cases. I've had women come up to me at conferences who were transphobic, who were so butch, I thought I was talking to a man for the first couple minutes, and then I realized this is a butch-identified lesbian. But they're so repressed and they're so, you know, hung up about the gender thing that, you know, and I just, you know, I'm kind of like the catalyst for all those feelings that they've been dealing with. So I think it has to do more with gender phobia in some ways than transphobia, that they had to deal with a gender-phobic cisgender society.
Yep. We're starting to get a few questions, so I want to circle back and maybe...
Uh-oh.
Yeah, no, good questions. One of them, how do you view the current spate of anti-trans legislation? What do you see as the root cause? I think you sort of touched on that, but would you feel like you wanted to elaborate?
You know, the right's looking for something else to whip up the base. I honestly don't believe even the people who are launching these arguments.
Riki, we need to bring.
Okay, sorry. Oh, my boom just fell down because I'm drinking. I'm sorry, I'm not drinking alcohol. I'm just drinking. I don't think the right is even really that concerned about trannies. I really don't. I think they're just looking for an issue that they think will whip up the base in red counties where they have no idea about diversity and have never seen or met a trans person or watched an episode of Will and Grace. And I don't think they're that concerned about trans people either. I mean, there are only about 6 of us in the entire country, right?
We're all on this Zoom meeting.
Yeah. I mean, not in Pennsylvania. I hear there are thousands of them in Pennsylvania, but it's not like you throw a stone out over your shoulder and you hit a trans person on the street. I mean, you know, so I'm not sure we're the big threat society. I just think they're looking for something to whip up the base, and right now we're something weird and strange that the base feels strongly about. And the idea that men are invading women's restrooms is just, I mean, they frame it really well, I have to say. For one thing, when we did the first lobby day, what's the big fundamentalist group, FARC, whatever it is, you know, immediately attacked us all as Maxwell Klinger. This idea of hairy, bearded guys wearing dresses will now be working on Capitol Hill. I think part of it has to do with, I'm not very big on cisgender society, so that's my cisphobia. So I'll out myself here, but cisgender people have this horror of gender crossing, which is why Jennifer Finley Boylan, who writes for the New York Times, is their trans op-ed writer, wrote a column about how refreshing it was to see a schlumpy middle-aged white guy play a transgender character. And I wrote a piece for the Advocate saying, you're completely wrong. It's always a big schlumpy white guy. When you look at Normal, where they had Tom Wilkerson, when you look at The World According to Garp, where they had John Lithgow, it's always a big slump because it ratchets up the sense of contrast and discontinuity for viewers. Like, oh my God, look at someone with big, huge shoulders and 5 o'clock shadow and deep voice wanting to be a woman. And then they kind of get these kind of reverse points for showing, you know, someone who doesn't look quote unquote conventionally good as a woman doing it. So they kind of get that reverse thing. But the other thing is, I think, is it would be terrifying if they had some hot, sexy, young transgender person who looked good, quote unquote, as a cisgender woman playing it. It would confuse people. As Jameson Green, who you're about to have on, and he wrote about this in his autobiography, Becoming a Visible Man, people don't have the same horror around trans men because they look like cis men.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't ding them and it doesn't challenge them. So I think there's this kind of horror around transgender women, which has to do with a huge amount of gender phobia among cisgender people. And I kind of hate that trans theory has kind of addressed this by trying to do this sex-gender distinction where sex is biological, but gender is, your inner identity and it's culture. So we should change that. And it's like, no, I don't think sex really exists either. We've been learned to see sex. I don't think sex exists any more than gender exists. They're both socially created categories. Let's just get rid of both of them. I don't think that anyone is actually there yet. But I do think there is this shock and horror about it. And the right is going to exploit that for a while. Now they'll move on to someone else like the intersex or who knows what else. So, and they're doing the whole thing around kids because, America does these continuing moral panics around children. We used to have a moral panic around homosexuals going after kids. And then feminists were going to turn girls into lesbians. And now they're going to do the trannies. We have to protect these kids because they don't really know that they're really transgender, and their parents are going to put them on hormone blockers, and life as we know it will end, and the earth will be destroyed by a fiery meteor. So, we drag out kids, it's like Pizzagate. They drag out kids to create horror and panic, and then they attach it to an issue, and we're just the issue of the moment. The interesting thing for me is, as painful as this is, particularly for trans people who are extremely vulnerable, like kids on the street, low-income trans people of color who don't have the amount of privilege that I am lucky enough to have, it's going to be really shitty for a while this stuff circulates and whips people up. But this is the last gasp of the right against trans people. If you remember back, 20 states passed laws against gay marriage because of its threat to straight marriage. We couldn't have gay marriage, and it was seen as a threat, and that was a last gasp thing. So it's always this thing that they do, and then people get kind of exhausted with it, and with the exhaustion comes a certain kind of acceptance. It's like people get tired of being panicked, so you have to continually ratchet it up and find something new. So we're going to go for it for a little while, and then a year or so it's just going to evaporate because no one's going to give a crap, and they'll move on. So I hate to say it, but I think this is what the final last gasp looks like before we have acceptance. Oh, the other thing, I'm sorry, I'm babbling here. But the other thing that I think is really important is by demonizing us, who is it? There was an article that came out, I think it was in Politico, that the national priorities of the Republican caucus this year were fighting back on critical race theory and addressing the issue of transgender people. I love it. So just think about that. We are now setting the national agenda for large swaths of the Republican Party. That is what real power looks like. If every single one of us got together and devoted all of our efforts to doing that, we couldn't have gotten anywhere close to this. So what it's going to do is people who've never heard or thought or even had any acquaintance are going to be thinking about transgender. And what happens is after a while, they kind of get used to it. So they are doing the work for us by demonizing us. Like I said, as painful as it is for people who are vulnerable, eventually people are going to get used to it. So they are doing a huge PR job for us. I wish they would do it in a more positive way, but people are going to get used to us. And then we're going to be like average, which is going to be really sucky. And so but it would be nice to be boring for a while. I'm sorry. What's the other question? I'm talking at great length. I'm sorry, I do that. You can mute me whenever you want.
One of the questions that Callisto brought up was invading a restroom seems a bit extreme. Most folks just want to go into a restroom just to do their business regardless of gender. How does that come into play around phobias when one is not stealth, not trying to pass, for example, not wanting to look or be cis?
That's a really good question. Who asked that?
Callisto.
Callisto, go write a book.
Exactly.
this is part of the problem with the way this has all been framed. We haven't really dealt with the scenarios that our own arguments generate when we talk about, you know, by the way, you guys are probably remember who it was, but there's a trans man, big guy, bearded, cowboy hat and everything, who used to march into women's rooms and take pictures of himself and say, "You want me to use my biosex bathroom? Fine, here I am." And he posts them online. It's a real hoot. I think if every trans man in the country did that, we'd be having a much different conversation.
I agree with that. Yep.
We need a few less trans men who are self and a few more trans men going into women's room, especially in red states where it's, you know, what they're supposed to do. But I think at some point we're going to have to deal with the idea of people who look like cisgender men. And I don't mean look like in the sense that they don't look good in a dress, quote unquote. I mean, they just look like cisgender men whose gender identity is feminine, who don't want, who are what they call no-ho, non-op, using women's room. And we're just going to have to figure that one out. And I don't think anyone's really grappled with that, but that is in fact where the arguments lead. Some people may have followed the huge demonstrations that occurred when supposedly a trans woman exposed her, should I say penis? I guess I should say girl clit in a spa in San Francisco, and all these you know Proud Boys and other groups showed up and demonstrated that you know this person was exposing themselves to vulnerable women, yada yada yada. It turned out there actually was, first of all, that is the law. In San Francisco, you get to use the changing room of your gender identity, but second, it turned out there actually was no such person. It was a bogus thing that someone had put out online and said someone could do this, and of course the right wing then ratcheted up and said, "Oh, someone did it." So what was fascinating to me was that I was the ACLU or HRC, I think it was ACLU, who responded by saying, you know, if these people are not comfortable with the idea that different women have different kinds of genitals, they shouldn't go there. I thought that was fascinating. It makes you rethink what genitals count as. Do genitals not signify sex? And can women have penises? I love that argument. I was just shocked to hear it from a national organization. It's going to reframe things in a lot of people's minds. It's an interesting way to say it. Women have different kinds of genitals. Some women have penises. I freaking love that. Yeah. But we're going to upend the apple cart of how cisgender people understand biosex. And that's what I think is also at the heart of trans people and the fears around what's loosely known as gender ideology. It does upend traditional sex roles. It's really difficult to have trans people who are visible and not have to rethink everything you know about sex and gender. And I'm personally in favor of that. I don't want us just to slide into binary cisgender roles. I'm especially happy with young trans people who, unlike me and my lamentable generation, are busy tearing down these walls. I mean, my daughter identifies as pan. Her best friend identifies as GenderQueer. Another one identifies as gender fluid. They use gender neutral pronouns. They are not going into these boxes. So I think they're going to overturn the apple cart, and more power to them. You know.
Someone remarked that the queer folk that are not in the binary or genderqueer sometimes find it difficult when traveling, especially to find a restroom, you know, without, you know, feeling weird about it or inviting some trouble.
I have to jump in here. I was actually driving down to Southern Comfort the first year we launched the Menace, and I had like a couple dozen T-shirts with me, and everybody who said they were going to come with me bailed. Says, I'm just going alone. And I really, really had to pee. And I was in the middle of South Carolina. And I walked into the restroom, and these two fembot cis women walked in, blonde-haired, blue eyes, young. And I heard their guy standing outside the bathroom, and I realized I was dressed in a Menace T-shirt. I looked just like I do now. No makeup, short hair, and I thought, I am going to die. They are going to beat the crap out of me and leave me on the ground for dead and make it look like an accident. You know, but I have a trick that always works. I call it the real girl flip. Here's what you do. Whenever you're around guys you think are hostile, as you walk out of the bathroom, you do this. Apparently men never do this, at least men who aren't hairdressers. This gets me out of more, I'm serious. I listen, I call it the airport flip. I do this in every airport because I travel a lot. I am constantly getting scanned like, okay, I'm going to get arrested because I see women staring. And I look just about like, I look as much like them as Arnold Schwarzenegger looks like the average male. And I'm always a foot taller than anyone else in the women's room. I swear, it's like the Oompa Loompas are always, it's a parade of the Oompa Loompas every time I go into the women's room in an airport just to catch my flight. And so if I look in a mirror and do the airport flip, they don't think I'm a woman, but at least they realize I'm being non-threatening and they let me get the hell out of there. And I never stop and wash my hands. But I got to tell you, it's humiliating to have to do and it's funny, I know I make fun of it. It's humiliating to have to do these ridiculous charades at 70. I mean, this is crazy. This is just crazy. By the way, we skipped over a question. I don't know if you didn't want to go to it, but someone asked another one that we kind of skipped. Oh, birth certificates.
Yes, we want to comment on, I guess everybody can see the chat, but the pros and cons of the new proposal of not having gender markers on birth certificates. What does this mean in the future?
I want to address a different question. Why is this Callisto person causing so much trouble in the chat? I think we should discuss that. What are the...
I think we need to channel her activism or their activism or his activism, whatever the pronoun is there, Callisto. I think you've got a lot to say there, and I really appreciate it.
I think it's Corinne has logged in under an assumed name. What's going on here?
Troublemaker, yeah.
What are the pros and cons? There didn't used to be gender markers on, well, there was always gender markers on birth certificates, but there didn't used to be gender markers on things like passports and driver's licenses. It started in the 50s, it was the 50s, I think, when they started adding it to passports. Until then, the idea, and it wasn't because they were gender tolerant. The reasoning was that any fool should be able to tell the difference between a man and a woman, so why would you need to mark it down in a document? But then there was this fear that men might, pose as women, so they had to start adding it to things, and now it's horrendous to get it changed. Is it, maybe it's London. I think it's London. I just read a whole article about, it's in the UK, where a city has a gender marker on your bus pass. So every single time the trans person gets in the bus pass and it doesn't look like it matches, they have to answer questions to a bus driver. Did you steal this? Is this really yours? Et cetera. Because you don't look like your bus pass and it says male on here, but you're clearly dressed in a skirt and high. It's just insane. I mean, it's just nuts. And why does cisgender society need to track and regulate sex and gender anyway? I have no idea what interest people have in this. I really don't. I was on a talk show once. It was a local CNN station. They had me with this right-wing bigot who couldn't. I was doing pretty well, actually. And finally, he just exploded in outrage. With, why would you do that to your body? And I said, do what to my body? And he said, well, what you've done. I said, what do you think I've done? He said, well, haven't you? I said, you don't know, and I'm not going to tell you. But I have to tell you, I have no interest whatsoever in hearing anything about what's between your legs. And it's a mystery to me why you would care what's between mine. I mean, really, why does anybody actually care? Well, there's global warming, there's the pullout in Afghanistan, there's COVID. Are really trans people using restrooms a huge item on the national agenda, and that somebody's transgender daughter might want to play soccer? I mean, this is a big deal? I mean, really? I just find it amazing that cisgender people even care about us. And I'm flattered by the attention, but I wish they'd find something else. Investigate dark matter, black holes. These are important things. We still don't understand why the universe is expanding as it is. Trans people are not a part of that. Not that I'm aware of, anyway. So back to the question. Back to the question, which has slipped out of our sites. I personally don't think there are, first of all, there are no gender markers listed on birth certificates. They are sex markers. And I think doctors should get out of the business of looking at your genitals. You don't have to put someone's genitals down on their birth certificate. Why do we need to know that? And why do people need to track that? Of what use is that to people? Why would people need to know that information? And by the way, sex doesn't exist anyway. It just appears that it exists. And it's really oppressive to intersex people. So I think it's stupid. I don't know if it'll catch on. I do like the fact that there are finally non-binary options on more and more things. People are going to get used to the idea that this is a non-binary world, folks, and it's not a game, and it's not a passing fad.
Right. There are some more questions in, but I want to cover a couple things that I wanted to ask you about too. So I'm going to give you kudos again for you. You were one of the, I think you were probably the first activist to recognize the murders of trans people. You
Yes.
started remembering our dead column in the 1990s.
You read my book, didn't you? I'll be damned. Someone who actually read that book. Yeah. It didn't exactly fly off the shelves, if you catch my drift. You may be the only non-family member who's bought that book, so thank you.
Well, you started this, and I'm going to quote from your transgressive book. And what you said was, quote, eventually you wake up to the fact that the violence is not going to stop and that nothing you're doing is really making a big dent in it. In other words, you can't stop a war from a mash tent. For that, you need to go on the front lines and fight a different war. So we know that murders are still going on at a great rate. We hold the mass vigil once a year in our communities, but have we made any progress? And what are the next steps in your opinion? We're aware of the violence. Why can't we eliminate it?
Well, that is a complex answer.
And
because the fact is,
but your thought,
I'm sorry?
I don't expect you to have the answer to this, but your thoughts around it would mean a lot.
Well, I don't know if it means anything, but I mean, look, the fact of the matter is that if you're Black and you're trans and you're young, chances are at some point you're probably going to turn to the only work that cisgender society, white supremacist cisgender society will let you have, which is sex work. And once you get into sex work, the odds of something violent happening, you rise exponentially. And I don't know that we can stop it necessarily by changing attitudes. We need to do that, but especially when it's, attached to any kind of sex work, which it is for a significant number. They're not all that way, but there are a significant number that are attached, in some way linked to sex work. We're going to have to find ways to not, for this society to be less transphobic and less racist. And, these are the people who are the most vulnerable right now in not only in the community, but in society as a whole. When we did our first national survey of trans violence, I think it was 82% were women of color, and something like 90% of them were Black women. Almost all of them from low-income communities, and almost all of them were, economically and socially vulnerable. And it just really increases the chance that you're going to have, a violent episode. People always blame us for doing it, but it's the one thing they leave us to sell. If you don't have an education, you've been kicked out by your parents, you can't be in school because, people keep bullying you. It's the one thing they leave us in a market economy that allows us to have, a bed for the night and a warm meal. And that just really has to change. That having been said, we developed the first, and I think the only evidence-based, the 1-hour intervention that has been proven to change violent and hateful attitudes towards transgender women. It's still actually online along with the video that goes with it. We had tremendous reductions in attitudes, and no one's using it. So that really pains me. It's actually, if anybody's interested, it's all up online along with the video and the intervention and the before and after measures, and our focus group research that we used to build it, because we had to look at what the attitudes were. And It's at www.impartofdc.org, www.impartofdc.org. It just pains me that that thing is not being used. We can change attitudes, though. And I think that's another important part of it. I think part of it, the reason it's not getting used is it doesn't necessarily use live transgender people. It uses a video of trans people. So it's not like, you know, having your local trans person come out and do a talk. It's intentionally meant for, you know, to scale up so you can show it to any group of young people. We're going to have to change some of these attitudes. It's going to take a long time. I actually thought I understood. Oh, I didn't realize. I'm just looking online. The American Medical Association recommends removing sex from birth certificates. That's freaking amazing. I didn't realize the AMA. That's really cool. Thank you for calling that to my attention. I don't know how I missed that one. But the other thing is, I thought I understood the issue, obviously having worked on it for 20 years, and I really didn't. I thought they hated trans people. We found in these groups, they don't hate trans people. They don't believe the category exists. I remember asking one group, what's the difference between gay and transgender? And one guy just looked at me and he said, you just made the word longer. So as far as they're concerned, these young men, we did like, I don't know, 3 or 4 focus groups. Category does not exist. They see this as gay men that are trying to seduce them into sex by appearing as women, full stop. And in that kind of environment, it's really hard to change attitudes if they don't acknowledge your identity at all. So we're going to have to think about that.
So, Riki, we're coming up on an hour, and so if anybody has any burning questions, get them into the chat right now. What did I didn't ask you about that you wanted to talk about?
I don't think I had any particular agenda. One thing I find that concerns me more and more is that the fact that our generation is getting older, and a lot of the activists that were really, you know, important in the early days are, you know, we've already lost Wesley Feinberg, and Kate has been very sick, although I understand she's actually doing better right now. But it worries me that our history is going to get lost. When I actually wrote Transgressive, I kind of rushed it into print because I was, you know, I wanted it to be the first, you know, the first trans book, the first book on the early years of the national trans movement. And then I'm increasingly becoming depressed by the idea that it might be the only book on the early days of the national trans movement, because it's, you know, it's dying out around us. You do things that in the moment, and then it turns out later they're a kind of history. And just as we lost like Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson, and some of those early leaders, were going to get to the point where we're going to start to lose people from this generation, and that kind of worries me. I guess the other thing that really I find myself thinking about a lot is how attuned young people are to gender. All these problems we're having around this, I really think are, I don't want to say they're going to go away. And obviously, if you live in a small rural community, it's going to be ugly for some time. But young people are just taking this in just such a phenomenal direction, and they're just so sophisticated. I mean, my daughter, I mean, I not only just do this for a living, but you know, I am one, and yet my daughter has better antenna than I do. I mean, I still struggle with gender neutral pronouns. She is flawless. She never makes a mistake. Her girlfriend, the individual who was her girlfriend, has since gone non-binary, and my daughter never makes a mistake with their pronouns. I still do. It's just they're so attuned to this stuff, and they're so outside the boxes that we learn to inhabit. And I just find that fascinating, and also really, it makes me really hopeful.
I agree.
I've never liked transgender identity. I'm going to piss people off, but I really don't believe in the terms transsexual and transgender. I never have. I've never had any sense of identity. It's like when I read stuff, oh, transsexual, transgender, like, no, they're silly words. They're made up words from cisgender culture to put people in boxes that they don't understand. I'm not a transsexual and I'm not transgender. I mean, I'll answer those because I have to, but it doesn't work. These are just silly. I call it, in my newest book, I call it cis-logocentrism. They're just terms that, they invented. We don't have to really believe in them too, though. Not to offend anyone who finds pride and solace in those terms.
Right. New book? You referred to a new book?
Yes, it's, I don't know what it's going to be called yet. I'm tentatively titled After Queer Theory, After Transgender Studies. And it basically goes through this whole thing. I think we're going down the wrong rabbit hole here with this whole sex gender model.
Yep. Not only blowing up the binary, but blowing up the whole model of sex and gender. Wow.
Well, it's hard to know a lot of intersex people and still believe in binary sex. Whoops.
Right.
By the way, I just lost my connection.
Yeah,
so it's reconnecting. So people are probably just luckily I've called in on my phone, so I didn't lose audio.
On my end, your video kind of froze, but you're there. You didn't lose a beat. But that's
interesting. On my end, it says connecting, and it's trying to get in. It's weird because we never lose internet connection here.
Uh-oh. Well,
luckily, I called in on my phone, so we can still get the audio, so we can continue.
It's the TERFs that work for Verizon, I think. I think they're after us. Anyway, I don't see any other questions coming in. So I think we'll wrap this up. And
sure.
Riki, many thanks. You don't know what a thrill it's been. I wish I could.
My pleasure.
Sit down and talk to you for like hours and hours and hours and have some adult beverages and keep talking. And but maybe we can have you back sometime, maybe when the new book is out. And
that would be great. And maybe you and I can talk one day about, I'm trying to do a book on interviewing on transgender and aging, because I don't think anyone's done that. So maybe you and some of the people listening to this call will agree to be interviewed.
Yeah, I mean, I think, like you mentioned, our generation of the early activists is coming to be of a certain age, and aging is something that scares a lot of us, and what that means when you're either gender non-binary or trans or whatever term you want to use. We really need to do that. Somebody wants to have a chapter on trans and menopause. And I'll let you guess who chatted that one in.
I decided not to do it. They said they could put me through a normal menopause by taking me off hormones. And I'm like, thanks. I've had hot flashes before. I don't need them. So I kind of have the worst of both worlds. I'm getting hot flashes and being called sir. But I haven't gone through the full thing. I just backed off the hormones as much as I could. So hopefully I'll never have to go through it.
I've had the same discussion with my primary care provider, and I am never going off hormones, and you need it for bone support. So remember that, the next argument. So
although I'm no longer producing eggs. So
all right. Well, I want to thank you all and thank Riki once again. And once again, join us on August 24th for yoga and health and wellness. And on September 7th, Jameson Green in Transitioning in the Workplace. So thank you all and good evening.